should America be a leader? Well, let me go through some of the reasons. Let's start with national security. National security is a sector where no one else is going to share their breakthroughs with us, nor do we want to share our breakthroughs with them. Otherwise, we're not going to be secure. And even with our allies, we often don't share that. And the fact that many technologies are dual use makes it very difficult to know exactly where to draw the line. A second reason why we want leadership is economic instability and growth. The very best vector for technology transfer is a student walking out of a university lab and going down the street to an industry and bringing that know-how with them. And that happens when the science is homegrown. We also are an ability to establish ethics and standards. Being first allows us to say how the technology is going to be deployed and what sort of ethical guidelines should be. And then finally, soft power and diplomacy. Other nations are really eager to benefit from US science, and this has been a way to win friends and influence people, even in countries that may not share our political views. So that brings me to this question. So how is the US performing today in terms of scientific leadership? If that's important, how are we doing? Well, the news is not real good there. Let's start here. China is now on track to exceed the US in R&D expenditures. That top line is increase in the total research and development budget in the US, federal, nonprofit, industry. But the red line coming up underneath it, that's China. The rate of Chinese investment in R&D is twice that of the US. And so you can see that it won't be very long before those two curves cross. And because of that Chinese investment, what does that produce? Well, it produces more research output. And we're already seeing that in research output. The US is dropping in its total percentage of articles being published in science, whereas China is, of course, increasing at triple-digit rates in terms of percentage. But we all know that counting publications is actually a pretty bad way to assess research performance. Many reports have documented the problems whenever there's an incentive to publish more. It can lead to predatory journals, paper mills, selling of authorship slots, and other forms of research misconduct. So let's ask the question instead, how much of these publications are actually good papers? So we can look at the top 1% of papers that are published. And what you can see is that the US for decades has been dominating the top papers, but notice that dip going towards today. And look at the rise in other countries. The EU is that red line, but that yellow line starting from the lowest here and going up to cross the EU, that's China. That's China rising. So they're not just putting out bad science, they're putting out really good science too. And then, of course, publications end up leading to new technologies, new therapies, new drugs. So we can say, well, let's just look at the percentage of drugs in phase 1 through 3 trials. Most of these curves are kind of flat and pretty anemic, with one exception. This one is the rise in Chinese drugs in the development pipeline. China was 3% of the drugs as recently as 2013, just barely more than a decade. And now it's up to 28%, while the US curve is on a slow decline. And of course, drugs come from patents. So how are we doing in patents? Well, that's where the scariest one is. Here's the US, here's China, China blew past the US in about 2015 and is on a meteoric rise. And after patents, what happens? Well, you get companies that start to prosper. And if we look at the international Fortune 500, not just US, this black wedge here, dark wedge, is the rise of Chinese industry. You can see that it was sort of a non-player in 2000, and now it has grown to actually pass the US in the total number of companies in the international Fortune 500. So this all suggests to me that there are very worrying trends. Nobel Prizes, they're a very lagging indicator. Nobel Prizes are typically given years to decades after the discovery was made. By the time we start losing out on the Nobel race, it will be too late.